I'd like to kick this off, being the late guy, but I'm excited about tonight's session. This will be a fun one to have and look back on. So, my name is Greg Goodland. I'm the Public Affairs Officer for the Rio Grande National Forest, and excited to be here with our partner Kelly DeFi from the San Juan Mountains Association, and present our the Forest Specialist series with a guest speaker of Price Heiner from the Rio Grande National Forest Heritage and Archaeology program. Whatever, Price, you'll do better than I am on that. So,
Was pretty close.
um, yeah, close anyway. So, anyway, yeah, we do this Forest Specialist series every month, and we've got a couple great ones lined up right after tonight's as well. We'll be talking about culturally modified trees next month, and wolves the following month. So should be pretty exciting. Um, we have just a couple of items to go over, and for that, I'm going to pass it over to our VIS coordinator, who you see on your screen. Again, that's our partner from San Juan Mountains Association, Kelly. Take it away.
Well, mostly it's just a little bit of housekeeping. We ask everybody to stay on mute while they're listening so that background noise can't cause a disturbance. The presentation's about 40 minutes. There's going to be question and answers options. If you do have a question, you can raise your hand by going down to the bottom bar there, and in the reactions there's a raise hand option, or you can put the question in the chat if you want to type it out. And let's see. I think that's about all we have a door prize. So if you want your name entered into the door prize, go ahead and put it on the chat list. This month, I thought, there we go. It's a stainless steel coffee mug with Colorado flags and stuff. It's insulated, vacuum sealed. It's supposed to keep things hot or keep them cold. So I think it's kind of a cool mug. So put your name in the chat if you'd like that. Also, if you want to be kept up to date on any of the happenings with SJMA, or just want to be on the list for whenever we have another one of these, you can send your email to me through the chat, where instead of having it to everyone, you just text it, or you just choose my name. The VIS coordinator, I think, is how I'm on. So I think those are all of the housekeeping issues. I think we can turn the time now to Price for the actual presentation.
Awesome. Thanks, Kelly and Greg. I guess I'll start off by saying, I want to thank everybody else for being here tonight, the audience. Super appreciate the interest and the attendance. So I'll just start with that. And then, of course, I might as well introduce myself. I'm Price Heiner. I'm the Forest Archaeologist and Heritage Program Manager for the Rio Grande National Forest. So you were really close, Greg. And tonight I'm going to talk about some archaeological testing. Here, let me bring up my and by testing I mean limited excavation. That's kind of what we mean by that in the archaeological world. At a really interesting, significant, and famous site called the Bunker Site in Saguache County, Colorado. So here, let me bring up my presentation and share my screen. There it is. All right, can everybody see that?
Yep.
Okay. I have this toolbar up top, but I need to get rid of just so I can actually start my presentation. Let's see, is that it now? Can you know how to minimize that toolbar up top? Wait, did that put?
There you go. Wait.
Okay, can everybody see that, and can everybody hear me?
Go to the get the toolbar back and go to the slideshow, and then just begin it from
I know,
there.
because the toolbar for Zoom is up top here instead of my toolbar for
I got you.
So that's what happened. I can't get rid of that toolbar for Zoom. I don't, unless you guys know how.
I don't believe I know how.
Okay.
Sorry
Then
about that.
minimize that.
We just get to see your next slide, so we're gonna, already know what you're talking about when.
Yeah, how do I minimize that? Let's see. How about that?
Okay, I can't see that.
All right. If okay, can everybody see that? Is that good?
I think that works.
All right. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to talk about some limited testing or limited excavation at the bunker site. And so we'll just jump right in. All right, so first I'd like to provide a little background regarding the bunker site, just to give people, I mean, it's been revisited several times. It's basically a world-class, multi-component, historic period and prehistoric site. So as far as documenting surface archaeology, it goes back to about the Middle Archaic, which is about 5,000 years ago, through the 1800s. That's basically what's been documented there as far as time periods in culture history. It's actually most noted is an old Spanish trail, what we call a paraje, or a rest area, a rest camp along the old Spanish trail. It's one of the best, if not the best one I've ever seen is in that regard, as far as just metal artifacts, cone tinklers, coscojos, knives, all kinds of metal artifacts from the 18th and 19th centuries. There's also a really good fur trade component there. So mountain man, traps, flintlocks, gun parts, that kind of thing. That's what it's most noted as, and that's what most of the focus has been on the site. It's been on those early historic period components. It's called the bunker site because of the gentleman you see right there. His name is Bob Bunker. He's a local amateur archaeologist and collector, also a rancher in the area. But he's the one that originally informed the Forest Service in 1981 about the site. And then the Forest Service went out and recorded it. And there's been revisits in 2009, 2010, 2012. And then, of course, the work we're currently doing on it, which was in 2022. But yeah, it's had a lot of attention over the years. So let me go to the next slide here. So now I'm going to jump forward to the current research. So the focus has been on that old Spanish trail occupation and mapping surface artifacts and features. And of course, there's been some prehistoric stuff on. There's a lot of prehistoric stuff on the surface there, but there's also an incredible amount of 18th, 19th century, early historic period stuff, which has been the focus of it. But what hasn't been explored with all these revisits over the year is sort of the buried prehistoric components. There hasn't been any testing, or very limited. The geoarchaeology, the geomorphology has not really been had any focus. And of course, it's because there's so much out on the surface that all those efforts in the past have been focused on recording all the surface artifacts and features. There's stone circles out there, but it's mostly been on the surface archaeology. So what our goal was to explore the alluvial. There's a giant alluvial fan that covers the entire site, probably 40 acres. So we wanted to explore the depositional context of that alluvial fan. So basically seeing what's below the surface and really trying to get an idea of the geomorphology, the stratigraphy, if there is any, and the depositional context. Of course, every archaeologist's dream is to obtain some radiocarbon dates on diagnostic artifacts. So that was our primary, that was our dream, that was our goal. But to just really understand the site as far as the geoarchaeology is concerned. Our particular interest was in early to mid-Holocene archaeological cultures in that area. And if you're not familiar with what the Holocene is, I'm sure most of you guys are on this call, but it's the period after the last ice age, so after the Pleistocene. So the Holocene started around 10,000 years ago when the last ice age ended, and continued on until almost modern times. They say we're in the Anthropocene now, which started it's debatable, but all the way from like the 1950s to 2000. So basically the Holocene, though, is most of starting at about 10,000 years ago up until modern times. So that's what we were interested in, is that really early Holocene period as well as the mid-Holocene on this site. One of the things that we're focusing on was the old Shara tradition. So that's kind of like the northern New Mexico, southwest United States archaeological chronology. And the Oshar tradition, especially the middle of it, which we call the Archaic, is just really poorly understood. And there's a lot of Oshar tradition archaeology out in this area, a lot of it on the surface. So we were wanting to address some of that, just the different archaeological cultures, how they relate, how old they are. We just don't know on a local level. So that was kind of what we were sort of focusing on as far as our research relative to the past 5 visits that have occurred. All right, so let me get into the methodology a little bit. This is kind of boring, the methodology, but it's a lot of people want to hear about it. So if you have any more questions about the methods we had, then please let me know, but I'm going to briefly kind of go over it. So the Rio Grande National Forest staff archaeologists and numerous volunteers. We've had Colorado College folks, we've had different just general public volunteers, but the most steady volunteers were Bob Bunker himself, as well as his wife, Judy. Again, he's there on the screen. I mean, he was there for, not only from the 1981 visit, but he was there for all the other visits, and he was pretty much the most consistent volunteer, him and his wife, Judy, that we had out on this site. So we had, I don't know, probably 12 to 15 folks working on this in 2022, and we've continued into 2023. But what we did is excavated 2 1-by-1 meter test units. It was actually 3, but one of them was a complete, we just got skunked. We didn't find any cultural material in it, and we hit dense boulders, just large boulders, at about 15 centimeters below the ground surface. So that I'm not even going to report on that test unit. It's these 2 that you see right here in the screen that were the most productive. We went down to almost a meter in one of them and 70 centimeters in the other before we started hitting those large boulders, which I think is basically set deposits from the last Pleistocene, but I'll go into that in more detail in a little bit. So we did 2 1-by-1 meter test units where we actually found a lot of archaeological material. Each unit was excavated using 10 centimeter levels so that we could control elevation and provenience on all the artifacts that we found, and faunal material. Anything found in place that we actually caught in place, we mapped it in place and collected it. Otherwise, a screen bag was created for each 10 centimeter level. So, you don't catch everything. There's a lot of little stuff you just don't catch. Sometimes big stuff, depending on who's excavating. But we screened everything through 1/8-inch mesh screen. So we caught just about anything that was larger than an 1/8 inch. So that's kind of the methodology we used. And again, I can go into more detail on that if anyone has any questions about that. All right, so now that I got all the background and the methodology out of the way, let's get into the results, which are the interesting thing. So what the results suggest is there actually is some site structure here. There is some intact stratigraphy, at least in the place we dug. So again, this is a huge site, this 30-40 acre site. So, but it is the same alluvial fan deposit across the whole thing, although I'm sure there's some major variation across the site. But where we were at, where we actually tested, we definitely had a lot of stuff on the surface, a lot of metal artifacts, cut metal, a cone tinkler, some stuff like that. So that early historic period component was on the surface. And then there were some loose surface sediments. And then right underneath that, we started having basically buried stratigraphy, buried cultural levels. The first one, you see that one that's labeled A, and that isn't a soil horizon A. That's just the A for the stratigraphic unit. But we found Pueblo-related artifacts in that upper level. So one of the pieces of pottery was probably the most diagnostic, and it dated to about 1,000 years ago. And then we had a couple of other buried layers that were definitely different soil layers underneath that top layer. So you see B and C there. We did find a buried fire pit. That's what that black F1 is. It was a small, would have probably been an unprepared surface fire where they just dug a small hole or a small depression and had a surface fire right there. It was full of charcoal and unburned wood. When we went through it, it had tons of oxidized sediment, the orange kind of oxidized sediment, classic unprepared surface hearth. We took charcoal out of that, and it dated to 2,338 years ago, plus or minus 30. So definite late archaic component. And then we actually found a projectile point in place. One of the excavators popped it out of the floor, and right next to it was some dense charcoal, just embedded in the floor of the unit, right next to that point. We ran that charcoal radiocarbon dated, and it ran at 2,547 years ago. So you can see we had 1,000-year-old artifacts up in A, 2338 in B, and 2547 down in C. So that suggests, just from the dating alone and the fact that we could identify several stratigraphic layers, that there is some integrity here subsurface. We do have basically buried campsites, one on top of another, sort of, so to speak, in sort of layman's terms. But then right underneath that 2547-year-old San Pedro point, we started hitting those dense boulders, large boulders and cobbles that I think are either glacial till. We don't know exactly what it is yet, but it's either glacial till, it's either the old stream meander. So it's where the old stream bed ran and then it meandered to its current location and started to grade at about 3,000 years ago. Or maybe it's it's more recent colluvium, that if we were to remove all those boulders and go deeper, we'd find deeper deposits. But I suspect that that is the terminal cultural layer right there, that those big boulders. So we got a disconformity is the problem. I mean, just like we got 2,500-year-old stuff, 2,600-year-old stuff, and then right on top of glacial boulders or old stream meander, which I'm thinking is probably about 10,000 years old. Although we didn't get any dates from those boulders, but just from the other geology, the surface geology and other things that we know about in the area, it probably is from the Pleistocene, those boulders. So we got to explain somehow that there's 10,000-year-old stuff and then 2,000-year, 3,000-year-old stuff sitting right on top of it. Where's the 7,000 years in between? That's one of the things that we're trying to address, and that's what we refer to as a disconformity. Was it scoured? Was it just the old stream bed? And then when it's meandered to its current location, it started to grade at that point. We don't know, but that's one of the things that we're exploring here. But up until the middle Archaic, it's really well stratified. It has integrity. So I'm going to come back to this slide once I go into a little bit more detail about the artifacts, the radiocarbon dates, and the faunal material, because it'll help illuminate this little better. This profile is what we call these. So you can see, yeah, it's sort of a profile of a wall of one of the test units going down to 70 centimeters. The levels on the left-hand side are each 10 centimeters. So that goes all the way down to 70, and then from the surface down to those boulders where we didn't excavate. So just to let you kind of know for context. All right, so results continued. We found well over 130 lithics in these two test units. Of course, just like anybody that does hunter-gatherer archaeology, prehistoric archaeology, the vast majority were lithic debitage, or the stone tool manufacturing waste flakes. So when you make stone tools, if you've ever flint knapped or seen it done, you notice there's a lot of waste flakes. There's a lot of stuff that's, we call that debitage or flakes. And I'm sure most of the folks on this call pretty much know that. But that was like 98% of what we found is those items. We also found 7 stone tools, which were also mostly in levels 1 and 4. If you look here, these two graphs, I couldn't get them labeled in Excel, so I'm just going to explain them. The bottom numbers 1 through 6 are the levels. So that's the first level is actually 0 to 20 because the ground surface undulated so much that some of the ground surface was already down to 10 centimeters before we even started excavating. So we went to 20 to make sure that we could level off that first level. So the first level 0 to 20, and then from there on, it's 10 centimeters down through level 6 in this particular case. Although we did 7 levels because we counted that first level as 2 because it was 20 centimeters. So just to give you a little context there. So those are the levels. And then the numbers on the left are the items. So that's the number of lithics. So you can see that levels 1 and 4 had the most stuff by far. And that also corresponds with the tools we found. So of the 7 tools, 3 were found in level 1 and 3 were found in level 4. That's also where most of the debitage was. So that's where I suspect the heaviest occupations were. And the only feature we found, so the only fire pit, was also in level 4. So I think those are the most intensively occupied layers. After the late Archaic, it looks like it wasn't occupied as heavily until the Pueblo period. That's kind of what these graphs are sort of telling you. So that's kind of the lithic debitage and the lithics that were found at the site. So the three tools that were found in level 1 include the tip of a projectile point, which is an arrow point, classic arrow point. We don't have the base of it, which is on the right there in the left photo. So we don't know what cultural affiliation it is, but it is definitely an arrow point based on its size. So, and then we also found a piece of Pueblo pottery and a piece of groundstone. So the groundstone was just this fire fractured mono. I didn't even picture it here just because it was it's so damaged and it was burned, and so it just looks like a big rock, basically on a photo. So, but we did find 3 tools in that level 1. The most diagnostic is that piece of pottery, which is very diagnostic, actually. We think it falls into the Taos Pueblo prehistoric pottery sequence. There's a couple different kinds of grayware that they call for Taos Pueblo. One of them is incised pottery. And I don't know if you can see can you guys see my cursor or not?
Yes, we can, Bryce.
Yeah.
You can. Okay. So you see this little mark here? That looks like an incised. So what they used to do is take like sticks or bones or some kind of tool, and they would make decorations in the outer pottery, and they call that incising. So you can see this little incise line here on the pottery, which is classic like Taos incised pottery. This is also punctate. So that's another type of Taos pottery. So I think it's somewhere in that category of Taos grayware, punctate, or incised. And they all date to this about the same time period, somewhere between, and they're really well dated in northern New Mexico. We didn't get a date. We didn't get any charcoal that was good context associated with this particular piece. So we didn't have a radiocarbon date on it. But it's well known to date between about 700 years ago and 1,000 years ago down in northern New Mexico. It's dated all over the place down there. So the way they make that punctate pattern is pressing some kind of object into the clay on the outside of the pot to create that kind of pattern. Often it's corn. So they'll take like a corn cob, and press it in, and roll it on the outside of the pot to kind of create that pattern. But we're pretty certain that's Taos Pueblo, either punctate or incised pottery. Again, pretty tight date of 700 years ago to about 1,000 years ago. And it was found in that top level. So that's where we're kind of coming up with that date. The 3 tools that were found in level 4, much older, getting back into the Archaic. This is more atlatl technology. So somewhere around 2,000 years ago, widespread, prehistoric folks transitioned from atlatls to bow and arrow. And of course, we don't know why. Still, I know several folks that have tried to address that question, and PhD candidates that are as well. But we still don't know the answer to why they're suddenly pottery and bone arrows and all that started to come out around 2,000 years ago. We don't see it in the record before that, really. So this is the older, what we call archaic cultures that were using atlatls. But both of these points were found in level 4. They're both diagnostic of and they fit well within the range of variation of what we call San Pedro, which is just a loose kind of term, Oshara tradition typology. And the one on the left, and you can see how they're both beat up too. They both look like they're reworked. They're both hammered. They're both pretty beat up, which is common at a base camp, like with what we think the bunker site is. So base camp, by meaning folks would come to an area and basically set up a camp where they would be their kind of central place to stay while they foraged in the area. So they would stay at a base camp, and they would do forays from that base camp to collect resources, whether it's stone, berries, botanical resources, hunting, but they would always send smaller parties out from the base camp, and then they would all come back to the base camp with the materials. The parties that are sent out, we kind of refer to as logistical camps, but we think this is a base camp. We think this is a major base camp, and it's common to have really beat up points, broken points at a base camp, because you'd obviously come back from your forays with damaged tools, broken tools, that kind of thing. You'd retool at the base camp and throughout the bases, throughout the damaged stuff, put on new stuff. So these are pretty hammered, these 2 points, but they both fit well within the range of variation for what we call San Pedro. The left-hand one unfortunately wasn't caught in place. We caught it in the screen in a 10 centimeter level. but it was in level 4. The one on the right is the one we caught in place, popped it out of the floor, and there was charcoal right next to it, and we got that 4,700-year-old date on that that point on the right. So now that I've kind of showed you guys sort of the diagnostics, what we call that we found on this project, let me go back to the profile. So again, that top layer, that what it's called, the A layer here. So that's where the arrow point was found, and the Pueblo pottery, that Taos punctate, Taos incised pottery, dating to about 1,000 years ago. And then this layer below it, which would have actually be between levels 2 and 4 in our excavation unit. That's where we found that fire pit. Didn't find any tools around that fire pit or anything, but it dated to 2,338. And then the level below it, we think there was actually some of the charcoal that we found. I don't know why that's moving. All right. So some of the charcoal that we had found next to this this point that we found in place in the wall next to it, it looked like there was another feature. We just missed it. But a lot of the charcoal that was associated with this point out here, we think was associated with that fire pit that might have been in the wall if we would have dug a test unit next to it. But and that one dated to, that's that orange point that we picked up. It dated to 2,547 years ago, plus or minus 35. And then pretty much within 10 centimeters, we started hitting these dense boulders that a lot of us think, and we don't know exactly. There's some additional work being done by PCRG, Paleocultural Resource Group. It's a group that does excellent archaeological work, and they did some more testing in 2023 to try to address some of this stuff. But we don't know what those boulders represent, if that is Ice Age or part of the Holocene, but I suspect it is part of the Ice Age. So again, we have a disconformity basically after the late Archaic. So that's kind of the profile, but this demonstrates that we really do have some nice site structure, at least where we dug, and intact stratigraphy. Everything is actually elevationally where it should be as far as its dates. Looks good. So let me go back to presentation here. So there's those 2 points again. The one on the right is the one we caught in place. And yeah, and the San Pedro type of point is actually part of the Oshara tradition. And again, we don't know a lot about them. So these dates we're getting are really going to help with fleshing out that local chronology that we just don't understand right now. So talking about the faunal material. So the faunal results suggest that most of the faunal material in the heavily occupied areas, which is levels 1 and 4, but most of it throughout was cooked or butchered. So again, the levels are at the bottom, 1 through 6. So 1 through 6, these are each of the levels. And then this number of items. So total bone per level. So there's 4 things per level. So that's level 1, all the stuff. That's level 2, that's level 3. So total bone, then I did amount of carbonized bone, which is bone that's blackened, it's been burned. Carbonization can happen a lot of natural ways. Doesn't necessarily mean cultural, doesn't necessarily mean cooking. You can have surface fires, you can have all kinds of things that carbonize bone. But it is worth noting. Now, a little less likely to happen naturally is calcined bone. So that's when bone gets burned so bad that it turns white. It kind of turns white, flaky. It even takes on a blue color sometimes because it's been so superheated that it turns chalky almost. That's a lot harder to get that kind of heat for that kind of time naturally, especially based on surface fires, that kind of thing. It does happen naturally occasionally, like if you get a root that burns underground and smolders really hot and there happens to be an artifact buried next to it, or a piece of bone that can get calcined. But often in archaeological sites, it suggests cooking a lot more than carbonized bone does. And you can see the amount of calcined bone per total bone, which is a lot for each level in this. But we can't say for sure that the carbonized or calcined bone is cultural, although the calcined likely is. But what we can say is that butchered bone is, and that's probably one of the most interesting things about this this graph here, is how much of it is what we consider quote unquote butchered. And I'll go through what we mean by that. And I'll show an example. But by butchered, obviously cut marks. So if you're disarticulating an animal with stone tools, often when you're cutting muscle, you're going to leave cut marks on the bone. We didn't get a lot of that. We only got, I think, 2 bones that actually have cut marks on them. But that is definite evidence of butchering. The less kind of just screaming butchering is what we call green bone break, spiral fractures, and impact fractures. So it's more of the marrow processing. So often what these folks would do is, and it happened throughout all prehistory and even into the historic period, but basically you'd butcher an animal, cut all the meat off, and then the long bones, especially, and some of the other elements, they have rich, nutritious marrow inside. So greasy, fatty, it's got a lot of nutritional value. And actually the natives would use it for making pemmican. So we think of pemmican as like beef jerky, but it really isn't. It's what pemmican was prehistorically was using some kind of fat or marrow as sort of a base, and then adding berries and botanicals and bits of meat and everything to this greasy ball. And actually the fat and grease would preserve it all. So it was a lot of wintering over food. So, and often how they would get the fat for that would either be fat from the animal, like the hump of a bison or something like that, but also the marrow. So they would break open the long bones with a big rock, smash the long bones, and other elements to get the marrow out, and that they would just eat that straight up. I've actually eaten it before. It's pretty tasty. It's kind of salty. It's not gross like you'd think. It's actually keeping the bone fragments out of it. They don't break your teeth. Is the hardest part of it, actually. So there's a lot of evidence of marrow processing here. So lots of green bone break, lots. And by green, I mean still a lot, very close to after the animal dies. When bone dries out and desiccates and it breaks in a very different fashion than when an animal's alive or very close to death. Which is when they would butcher it and process the marrow. So we got a lot of green bone break, a lot of spiral fractures, a lot of impact fractures. Very few cut marks, but there was a couple that we noted, and I'll show you in the next slide an example of a bone that has everything, that had the cut marks, spiral fracture, green bone break, and an impact fracture. But a lot of it throughout the levels. So I think this represents, I think, what this base camp was. Obviously it was for foraging, but they were doing a lot of hunting and processing the game at this site, which makes sense. So let me show you an example of faunal material that has everything I'm talking about. So this is a long bone fragment, and it was about 8 millimeters thick. So we're getting into like elk, bison size animal just from the cortical bone thickness. But you can see the cut marks right there. So those are cut marks from stone tool butchering. This was found down level 4, by the way. So it's probably the same age as the point we found down there, 2,600 years ago. So you can see the cut marks. You can see this, what we call a spiral fracture. So if you've ever broken a bone that is green from an animal, instead of just smashing and exploding, it'll spiral. And that's what we refer to as that spiral fracture green bone break right here. So it creates these very smooth edges. And just is very diagnostic. So we got the cut marks, the spiral fracture, green bone break, and then you can see this impact fracture right here. So, of course, the other part of it is probably in other fragments, because when they hit it, it exploded into little fragments. So the rest of this impact fracture would probably be in other fragments that broke off. But this is a good example of what I consider to be butchered bone. And we found quite a lot of this throughout the levels. So there's some other examples of butchered bone. I can't tell what that is, but I think that's cut marks. It was hard to tell. It just doesn't look natural. This is part of a long bone. This is the natural, probably part of a metapodial, so lower leg bone. So that's that groove that kind of goes on the length of a metapodial, so the lower leg bone of an ungulate. But I think that's cut marks. You can see the cut marks there. Looks like that has green bone break too. Cut marks here as well. This is more of a flat bone fragment. I'd either scapula or something like that. I mean, everything was so pulverized into little pieces from marrow processing that it was difficult to identify elements here and there. But we did have a lot of what I would refer to as butchered bone. So just kind of going back full circle, it just looks like there's a lot of structure to this site, down to that disconformity, and just loaded with butcher bone artifacts. We had a couple of diagnostics we got dates on, so really promising. And then, like I said, PCRG, Paleocultural Resource Group, Mark Mitchell and Chris Johnson. There's a group of very good archaeologists have done some more testing at this site, and in the same kind of general vicinity that we did our 2 test units in, to try to see if this is just a local phenomenon or not. Like where we tested, or if it's more characteristic across the site. So I guess this is my last slide here. I don't know how much time I used, but the conclusions in future research. So the test excavation suggests the alluvial fan that covers the site contains a well-stratified late Holocene archaeological record. So we're talking old Spanish Trail, mid to late 1800s on the surface, overlying a late prehistoric Pueblo occupation of around 1,000 years, which then overlies a couple of late archaic occupations, one around 2,300 years ago, another around 2,500 years ago. And then that's sitting right on top of these boulders, large boulders. I mean, some like the size of a dining room table, and then others, bowling ball size, but just really large boulders. However, there is a huge disconformity between the late Holocene and the Pleistocene age, or at least I'm thinking there is. I'm kind of interested to see more of what Mark comes up with as well. But as a result, the context for early and middle Holocene archaeology, so somewhere between 10,000 and 3,000 years ago, BP means before present. I'm sure you guys know that, but just jargon. So we seem to be missing the deposits from 10 to 3,000 at the location we tested. And again, I don't know if it's from scouring or if that's where the old stream was. Up until about 3,000, then it meandered into its current location, and then sediment started to deposit on top of that old stream bed, or if it is actually glacial till itself from small in place glaciers, where those boulders would have been in the ice, and then when the ice melts, they just kind of deposit in place, But I don't know. We don't know what that represents. All I know is it seems like the late archaic deposits are sitting right on top of that. But that's something we need to explore. So the future research is going to be to continue to explore the alluvial fan. Are the current results a localized phenomenon, like I just talked about, or does this generally characterize the entire alluvial fan across the site? And that we don't know yet. Also, we're going to continue to explore the culture history of the site, especially the buried prehistoric components. Like I said, surface stuff, they've found stuff going back to 5,000 to 6,000. But so far, buried, all we're finding that's intact is up to 3,000. So we're just going to continue to try to discover what's going on there and try to explore that. So that's all I got. Until next year. How do I stop sharing? Oh, there it is.
All right. Well, I'm coming back. I'm not quite sure where Greg is, but now is everyone's chance to ask any questions that they might have or
He
anything
must have
like
gone
that.
off again.
Yeah, he
Can you
must
hear-
have gotten kicked off.
Can you still hear me after I stop sharing?
Yeah, I can still hear you and see you. Anyone who's got any questions can go ahead and unmute.
I
There's
have a
Greg.
The geology of the area, which would help to explain some of the questions you have there.
Oh, sorry, but I didn't hear you, Art. What was that?
So what do we know about the geology of the area? That may help explain something about that nonconformity, and also the times at which those various layers were deposited geologically.
And there has been some work in that regard. And so like that mass wasting deposit, or that's kind of how it's described, sounds like folks had mapped sort of a big colluvial outwash that was like 100,000 years ago. But I don't know if that's what we're hitting here locally. The way they described it, it could be it. But I'm not sure if we're down into that stuff. And we are really close to a creek too. So we're really close to a current stream course. So I don't know if it's that stuff that's 100,000 years old. It just doesn't seem likely. Although Mark was saying the same thing. Mark Mitchell was wanting to explore the possibility that, and I forgot what he called the deposit, but it's really old, like 100,000 years old. And is it that, or is it that we're next to this stream course and we're dealing with the old stream channel? So, I mean, that would be surprising if it was 100,000 years old and then we suddenly just have 3,000-year-old stuff on top of it. That would be even a huger disconformity than what I think it is, which is the Pleistocene or the old stream channel where the stream had meandered. But we are looking into that, Art. That's a really good question.
I have a what'll sound like a dumb question since I got on late. Where is this site located?
We can say exactly, but it's over by Crestone.
Okay.
Area over there. Yeah. It's up it's in the vicinity of
just the ballpark general part of what,
yep,
what part of the area
that's
we're talking
where it is. No. Good question.
Yeah.
Jason.
Since you said that, so my next question, I have a couple questions. So have you talked to the geologist with the Park Service? Because I think Patrick would have some really good insight on the geology and the sort of the structure of those sediments.
Yeah,
so we sort of come out of the Sangres. Patrick
yep.
Myers, I think is his name, right?
Valdez, and I think it's
Patrick Valdez. Andrew, sorry.
Andrew Valdez. Yeah, so I did. He actually came out to the site because I wanted him to see this deposit. And I was just like, "Can you look at this profile, Andrew?" And he's like, "That could." And the same thing, he said that could be. And I forgot what deposit he called that 100,000-year-old deposit, which would still be the Pleistocene, because the Pleistocene went from 1.8 million to about 10,000 years ago. So 100,000 years ago is still the Pleistocene. And that's why I was saying a minimum of 10,000, because that's when the Pleistocene ended. And so he's like, I can't. And we were saying the same thing, that he didn't know if it was part of that giant deposit. It's 100,000 years old. I wish I would have talked to him, got the name of that deposit, or if it's the old stream meander. So we're working with
probably from the last sort of little ice age, and there were glaciers in those valleys, all those Sangre valleys, and those things washed out. It could have been something like that. And I don't know if
that's what he was thinking, because it's very unsorted.
Yeah.
So it looks like it's like mass waste, it doesn't look like it's alluvial, like know, like how in stream channels things will sort out class size wise. You'll get the bigger stuff deposited upstream, and then as it goes down, you get the smaller stuff deposited. It doesn't look like that. It's completely unsorted. So we think it's some kind of like major colluvial deposit, but it just doesn't make sense that it could be 100,000 years old and then 3,000-year-old stuff right on top of it, nothing in between. Makes more sense that it's probably 10,000 years old, or when that stream had meandered, which could have been even more recently, like 5,000. I mean, we don't know, but that's something
it probably happens pretty frequently, every few thousand years or something.
Yeah, and we didn't find any organics down there, so like nothing down there, which makes me think it was more scoured, because we didn't even find charcoal trapped in there, no wood, so nothing to try to date that deposit. But that's something that we've got Andrew Valdez on the Park Service, and we also got Mark Mitchell on. So I wish I could tell you more about it. I don't know at this point. Good questions. And if anybody else has any insight into what that stuff might be, and of course we looked at surface geology maps. They're very gross, poor scale, so it's really hard to get a lot of data out of them. But it's some big stuff. Like I said, the biggest stuff is probably the size of a dining room table, the boulders. Smaller size stuff is bowling ball to softball stuff, but just all unsorted. And then we started having sediments of grade on top of that were clearly, I don't know exactly the base of those, but that point we found was only 10 centimeters above those, and it was 2,500, 2,600 years ago. So probably around 3,000 is when sediment started to grade on top of that boulder deposit that we don't know a lot about at this point. It might be worth getting geology. Yeah, I mean, I agree that often we're not dealing with stuff this old. So to get a geologist, a true trained geologist out here to look at this, like maybe Daryl or I think it would be good to get Daryl or Patrick out here to look at it.
Yeah. All right, one more quick question on the biology
Yeah.
side. I'm a biologist. So, is there any attempt to get genetic information from those bones, or because they're cooked, you can't do that? Has anyone ever thought about that? I'm just
No.
curious what species of animals were in those pits.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the Pleistocene, we're not too interested in getting the genetic information. We're spending most of the money that we have on the radiocarbon dating on trying to date the deposits. And one of the reasons is because post-Pleistocene, so Pleistocene would have been interesting if we had a Pleistocene deposit. And we were dealing with that because there's a lot of Pleistocene megafauna that went extinct, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, camels, horses, they were all around and they went extinct. And then the Holocene, we pretty much have modern species. So we're talking like elk, deer, and everything we would be familiar with replaced those Pleistocene megafauna. So we know it's something like that. So we often go by, especially the larger ungulates, is cortical bone thickness. So we can look at the long bones and how thick the cortical bone is before you get to the cancellous bone that's inside. And there's a pretty good index of the thickness of the cortical bone and what kind of critter you're dealing with. So you get into 8 millimeters plus, which is what ours was. You start getting into elk, 10 plus, you're into bison. Deer tends to be 6 to 8. So we could just based on long bone thicknesses, we kind of got an idea that yes, we have mostly deer probably there. A lot of smaller animals, but it was so pulverized. It was so difficult to tell. Definitely, we think that one long bone was bison. So yeah, I think the typical players, deer, bison, elk, and then lots of small game. So because it's the Holocene, we weren't as interested in getting that genetic information off of it. And we only have limited budgets, like Jason. So we spent the money we had on the radiocarbon dating. Good questions. No, I appreciate it. Any other questions or?
Let me ask the question. I mean, I'm curious, you just mentioned money and what organizations are interested in funding the operations like the one you explained today? I mean, I'm sure it's more than just the Forest Service.
Yeah, so that would take grant writing. So I think the Colorado Historical Fund would probably be interested in this. But often what we do is we fund other organizations to help us with this. So like PCRG, for example, the Old Spanish Trail funds that we get every year. We get about 20,000 in Old Spanish Trail money. And of course, it has to be done on work with sites that are associated with the Old Spanish Trail. And this is, like I said, the bunker site is one of the most noted parajes or camp rest areas along the Old Spanish Trail, just really well known. So I've been using our funding to fund these firms like PCRG and other things to investigate this site further. So because it is along the old, it's immediately adjacent to where we think the Old Spanish Trail ran. And it's probably one of the better rest camps and reoccupied, it looks like, for at least a few decades. This is one of those spots where they would, probably out of Taos, we think, they were thinking this was a spot to reach on the first day. It's like, okay, we got to make it to, I don't know what they called it, but we got to make it to the bunker site. And that's where they'd camp that first night. It's one of those really reoccupied historic sites. So right now we're funding most of this research and we're bringing other folks in. If I wanted to blow this up more, but most of what we do is compliance work. So we clear other projects, we clear timber sales and fuels projects and road building and dam projects. And so that takes 90% of our time. I would have to really expand my time on projects like this to write grants to get it funded. So I just use my funding that I get to help with this. And it makes that a lot easier and cleaner. Good question, Greg.
Thanks. And I have one more, just more of a comment more than anything. It's like what a primary thing that I heard today during your presentation is that you've answered a lot of questions by pulling out the objects that you've seen and making the analyses on what's around them, etc. But I feel like you've just opened the fan for far more questions.
Oh yeah. That's one of the things I think most scientists say is the more work you do, the more questions you generate. You answer a couple of questions and then generate 12 more.
Right.
And that's always the game with, and especially archaeology and most sciences actually. So research often generates more questions than it does answers. But we are starting to get there. I think we didn't know that at this point. I mean, I remember talking about being out there at one time with Bob and recording some of the surface stuff and just thinking this alluvial fan could be 30 feet deep. Like we didn't know. But now we know, at least that it's actually pretty shallow, at least where we dug. So, and like I said, we contracted this firm, Paleocultural Resource Group, to do another. We did 2 test units, 3. One was just totally negative, but so 2, and they did another 4 that 2 of them went even deeper than we went. So they found spots that went. So I'm really curious because they're doing all the artifact and faunal analysis now. They're going to produce a report and send it to me probably in January or so. And I'm just really curious as to what their results are. And they put their 4 test units in the vicinity of where we put our 2. So it should help a lot. And then Mark is also
follow-up presentation to this one, didn't I?
Oh gosh, yeah, I'm going to do that again next year. Once I get that result from Mark, and maybe he'll want to present it, and maybe I'll do something else. We have plenty of other stuff that we're kind of picking away at as far as just research, but maybe Mark will want to present that. But I'm really curious to see. He's also doing a lot more work on the geology, like you guys said. Looking into the literature a lot, and contacting folks that might know. And he's also a pretty good geoarchaeologist himself. So we'll know more next year at this time. So.
And you're gonna make me wait. Ay, ay, ay.
You can come out and dig holes with us.
Well,
do
Bryce,
that for you.
I'm truly grateful, and we're running up against the time here, so I'm gonna open it up for any last questions that may be out there. We'll see if they're still pending in folks' minds. Oh darn! I don't want this one to end. So
it's to be continued. This is just preliminary. This is just the very beginning of this, and I'm really curious to see if this is a localized phenomenon across that alluvial fan, or if it's variable, or if it's just like deep in some parts, and we really don't know at this point. And then what that boulder field is. Those are the 2 things I want to know the most about.
So we need to buy excavators for you for your program, is what you're saying?
Yeah, there you go. Have Fire give me a backhoe.
All right. All right. Well, I think I'm going to turn it over to Kelly here to talk about who's got the door prize for today.
All right. Well, Price, thank you. That was really, really interesting.
Thank
you. Can tell you it was Lisa. Lisa won our mug tonight. So Lisa, if you want to give us congratulations. Give me your coordinates, or not your coordinates, your contact information, and we'll get that to you. Is Lisa still on? Yeah, there she is. Okay.
Yeah, she's there. Oh. So, well, I guess for closing remarks here, I think this is absolutely wonderful that everybody came on, and I'd like to officially say thank you for joining us again next month. We're looking forward to another historical, cultural perspective on culturally modified trees. So take a look for that on the Forest Facebook page. And Yeah, we hope to see a bunch of you back next month and again the following months. One of our speakers, our next speaker is on screen still. Jason's going to be presenting on wolves for us, but not in the aspect that some of your minds might have gone to already. We're not going to talk about the discussion of whether or not wolves should be there. We're just going to talk about the wolves themselves. So looking forward to both of these and having all you join us again. On behalf of the National Forest, the Rio Grande National Forest, and the San Juan Mountains Association, who is our host and Zoom program host. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day, everybody.